What are the mythological origins of the Japanese archipelago, and which of the islands was the first to be created? Let's look into it. Hello everyone! Today I wanted to make a short video from the comfort of my government-mandated quarantine hotel. Yes, that's right, I had the audacity to travel during a pandemic, so this is my punishment, I guess. The one silver lining is that the view from my hotel room is quite nice, and it inspired me to talk about the story of the creation of the Japanese islands according to Shinto mythology. In the distance behind me, if you look really closely, you might be able to make it out, is the island of Awaji, what would otherwise be just another one of Japan's thousands of islands, were it not for the fact that it was the very first island to come into being according to the Shinto creation myth, begotten by the gods Izanagi and the goddess Izanami way back in the ancient mists of time. Okay, so spoiler alert, I made it out of my government-imposed prison cell, and I'm now free. And it feels wonderful. So going on to our main topic of today, I actually don't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty of the mythology and the founding myth of Japan because it gets really convoluted, as almost any Shinto myth does. There's a lot of strange ins and outs and rituals and things like that. But really what I wanted to do was tell the basic story, talk about how it's been misrepresented in some media these days, and then also see what it can tell us about the differences between how Japan was considered or imagined in the minds of the people back then as opposed to today. So without further ado, let's get into it. If anyone's ever seen The Last Samurai, and you'll have to excuse me if I'm getting some of the details wrong, it's been quite a while since I saw it myself, but you'll remember at the very beginning of the movie, it starts out with the tale of the creation of the islands of Japan. How a god dipped his spear into the sea, lifted it up, and the water droplets that came off the tip created the archipelago of Japan. Now, that is slightly right, but it actually gets the story wrong in a couple of different ways. So let's tell the story as it is actually known and written in the ancient sources. It all started with the creation of heaven and earth. Back in the beginning, the earth was still a primordial soft mush that hadn't formed into any of the continents or lands that we know today. Now, as far as the gods are concerned, originally there were primordial gods. There were several generations of these, starting with the first 5. These original 5 gods were neither male nor female, nor did they reproduce. And these were lone deities that I'm not going to speak much about today. They were followed by the 7 divine generations of gods, the last 2 being Izanagi and Izanami, the brother and sister couple that were tasked with the creation of Japan. Now, on to the creation itself, which starts with Izanagi and Izanami standing on the Ame no Ukihashi, which was the floating heavenly bridge, from which they were able to look down upon the churning stew that was the earth in its early days. It is from this bridge that Izanagi was able to dip his legendary spear down into the churning waters, or the stew, the concoction that was the earth back then, pull the spear out, and from the tip, as the movie The Last Samurai says, the droplet created the first island. But where the movie gets this wrong is this first island was not actually any of the islands of Japan as they are known today or exist today. It was actually a sacred mythological island known as Onogoroshima. And it was from Onogoroshima that the gods were able to descend to the earth. They had a platform to stand upon from which to create the actual islands of Japan. Where this Onogoroshima is today, no one really knows. It may not exist anymore, but that's the story of the spear dipping into the water and dripping to make the islands. Okay, moving on. So after they created this island, they erected a holy pillar in the middle of it, and they initiated some sort of, I have to say this, and this is not to disrespect the Shinto religion, but there's a lot of very odd things within it. Basically, in order to create the islands of Japan, Izanagi and Izanami needed to have sex in order to produce the islands. So the islands didn't actually come from any sort of primordial stew that the earth was at the time, but they came from the joining of this god and goddess. However, they were the first two beings to ever actually have sex. So the lead up to this event is rather interesting, and I'm going to tell it in its translated entirety here. While standing on Orogoroshima, near this big pillar they had erected, they initiated a conversation that ultimately led to the conclusion between both of them that they should have sex in order to proceed with the creation. Now, here's a translation of the conversation they had, and of course this isn't perfect, but more or less this is how it went. Izanagi started by saying, "How has your body been made?" Addressing Izanami, the goddess. She said, "My body is fully formed, except for a part which has not quite grown." To which Izanagi replied, "My body is fully formed, except I have a part that has grown too much. If I place that part of my body that has grown too much and plug the part of your body not yet grown, we will produce lands and dominions. What say you to this?" Now that's a pickup line if I've ever heard one. Izanami accepted this offer, and she suggested that they walk around the pillar in some sort of ritual before actually committing the deed, as it were. After they circled the pillar the allotted number of times, Izanami, remember, the goddess, was actually the first to speak, and she blurted out something to the effect of, "Oh, you are a beautiful and kind youth," talking about Izanagi. Now, at the moment that she said this, Izanagi was a little bit irked because she was the first to speak, which he deemed inappropriate, being that he was the male or the husband in the relationship. So again, these tales have not exactly aged well, but despite this, apparently Izanagi's libido had been sufficiently stirred enough to where he was able to still go through with the act, and they had sex for the first time. The first product of their joining was a child known as Hiruko, or literally leech child. So this was a botched job, let's just say. The child was deformed, was not quite right, and so they cast the child adrift into the sea. The second result, or the second product of their joining, was the island Awashima. Now again, this island was considered imperfect, and very clearly something had gone wrong in this ritual. So they ascended into heaven, the two of them, and they consulted with the other gods, who came to the conclusion that it was in fact the fact that Izanami spoke first that had caused the corruption in their initial mating. So apparently it is not right for a woman to speak before a man, damn it. No, I'm just kidding. So having learned what they did incorrectly the first time, they proceeded to descend back to Earth and do the ritual properly this time, which resulted in the islands of Japan. Here's where things get really interesting. I'm going to conclude the actual myth, as it were, there, and talk about how the original conception of Japan differs quite greatly from how Japan is viewed today. Firstly, and interestingly, the original islands to be created were numbered as 8. They were called the 8 Great Islands of Japan. Now, to anyone who knows anything about Japan today, if you were to list the Great Islands of Japan, you might say, okay, we've got Kyushu in the south, we have Honshu, the main island where most of the action that we know in history took place. We've got Shikoku, the smallest of the main 4 islands, but still one of the main ones nonetheless. And finally, up north, we have Hokkaido. So today we conceive of Japan as being 4 main islands, or 4 great islands, if you will. But back then, apparently, they were 8. And also interestingly, Hokkaido wasn't even listed on these first islands because it had yet to really be discovered yet or to be colonized by Japanese people. And this brings us back to the beginning of this video, talking about the very first island to be created, which was Awajishima. Awajishima today is beautiful. It has some nice hotels. I've stayed there with my wife before. It has shrines to Izanagi and Izanami, the original creator god and goddess. And it's just an overall nice place to visit, but honestly, it's pretty overwhelming as far as Japanese islands go. So I was really surprised to learn, as you probably are, that it was the very first island according to the myth. So it does hold a special place within the history and legend of Japan. Although I'll be honest, not a lot of Japanese people actually know this. You have to really dig back into those old documents to know this information, and for reasons, perhaps, this is my theory, that we've already discussed in this video, a lot of modern day Japanese don't put a lot of stock in those original myths. They're just kind of generally known amongst the population. Now, proceeding down the list, after Awaji Shima, the second island to be created was Shikoku, interestingly. But at the time, it was known as Iyo no Futana no Shima. And there's a whole history behind that I won't get into. The third island was Oki no Mitsugu no Shima, or today, the Oki Islands. Then, Kyushu was number 4, at the time known as Tsukushi no Shima. Number 5 was Iki no Shima, or Iki Island, as you might know from the most recent expansion of the Ghost of Tsushima video games, which I highly recommend, by the way. Which brings us fittingly to number 6, which was Tsushima Island itself. Number 7 was Sado no Shima, which is today also known, it's still known as Sado Island. And finally, number 8 was Ohoyamato Toyo Akitsushima. Man, that's a mouthful, those old names. But that is today's Honshu, the main, largest middle island of Japan. As I mentioned earlier, Hokkaido was not on this list, nor were the Okinawa Islands, because Okinawa was a separate kingdom at the time and it wasn't considered to be part of Japan. You'll have to excuse the racket behind me. There's a train going across the Seto Ohashi Bridge, which actually fittingly links me to today's story. I am now on a little peninsula of land on Honshu Island, and right here is where Honshu and Shikoku meet. Off in the distance, there's a couple islands in between. This bridge links Honshu to Shikoku Island, so I thought it would be a good place to film this video. Well, anyways, I'm gonna keep this video short. I hope you found that interesting. Every now and again, it is nice to look into mythology to give us indicators of how views have changed on things over time, and I thought this was a good example of that. As always, if you're interested in content about Japan, occasionally mythological content, sometimes historical content, history, stories within history, interesting things that have happened, big events, or the outdoors, things of that nature, please consider liking and subscribing. And with that, I'll call it a day. I think it's time to head back to my car. It's been beautiful, but all good things must end. Until next time, take care everyone.